The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 30th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. Coming up on today's programme, the EU says it won't recognise the democratic legitimacy of Venezuela's election. What does this mean for Nicolás Maduro? Indonesia and Australia have signed a defence agreement. We'll get the details on this upgrade of their military relationship. We'll be in Prague to hear from Estonia's former president, who spoke to our team at Globsec.
People in Estonia said it's the first time somebody from our region gets such a job, because the last time was Donald Tusk and everybody has already forgotten that it has ever happened.
Plus, a roundup of the day's business stories and then some very exciting news from Fernando. What is it?
Hello, Georgina. This morning it's been decided. The city of Basel is hosting Eurovision next year.
We'll hear more about that and also what our editorial director Tyler Brulé has to say about the selection. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Georgina Godwin. Venezuela went to the polls at the end of July, and the Electoral Council proclaimed Nicolás Maduro, in power since 2013, the winner. However, the result has been much contested. No official voting tallies have been published, but the opposition has released figures showing a landslide win for its candidate, Edmundo González. 10 Latin American governments and the US have said they categorically reject the Venezuelan Supreme Court's decision to confirm Maduro's win, and they've now been joined by all 27 countries of the European Union. I'm joined by Dr. Katie Brown, who's a senior lecturer in Latin American Studies at the University of Exeter. Katie, many thanks for coming back on the show. Can you tell us more about this EU decision?
Thank you for welcoming me back, Georgina. So, as you said, the EU has denied democratic legitimacy to Maduro's government. This was a statement that came from Josep Borrell, the foreign policy chief, although Borrell himself also said that this will have no immediate consequences for Maduro. It's really more of a symbolic statement at this point. But it's worth noting that there are thousands of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in the EU who have been out on the streets protesting, particularly at the Great World Protest on the 17th of August. And I think for them, this will be meaningful, even if it doesn't actually have any real consequences for Maduro at this moment.
And that's because the EU doesn't have sanctions on Venezuela or anything like that right now.
Exactly, yes. Also have said that they're not considering sanctions at the moment. So this is really a kind of wait and see what happens. But I think it's just adding an extra voice to, as you mentioned earlier, all of the voices across Latin America and the US who are speaking out against Maduro. So obviously we're thinking about the EU here, but it's worth remembering that the president of Chile, for example, Boric, has repeatedly spoken about the fraud. For example, the Uruguayan representative at the Organization of American States has been making very impassioned speeches about the historic levels of repression and torture that are now happening in Venezuela to try and maintain that fraud.
I wonder if this will have any implications for Mercosur, the Southern Common Market, because the EU's been quite involved in boosting trade between the two blocs. Now, I know Venezuela's membership was suspended in 2016, but I wonder if this reduces the chance of it ever rejoining.
And that depends very much what happens, what's the outcome, because certainly the opposition are very keen to re-engage Venezuela within movements like Mercosur. Their whole plan before the election was saying we want to change Venezuela to a country that will welcome people back. If Maduro is able to stay in power, then absolutely, I think this weakens the chances of Venezuela ever joining those kinds of organisations again.
And is the EU prompted, as some South American countries have been, by the fear of an influx of Venezuelan migrants?
Absolutely. I think that's probably more of a concern for countries that are closest to Venezuela, particularly countries like Colombia, Ecuador and Brazil, which have seen millions of Venezuelans arrive, often on foot. But even in the EU, as I mentioned, there are increasing amounts of Venezuelan migrants. Just before the election, something like 40% of the population said that if Maduro won, they would consider leaving. So that's absolutely a concern for countries across the EU.
Has there been any reaction to the EU decision from Maduro himself?
Not that I could find, although this is a quickly evolving situation. Certainly, Maduro, as well as the CNE, so the Electoral Council, the Supreme Court, are all holding firm to the idea that they legitimately won the election. They are calling any reactions against them terrorism. So we've had over 2,400 people, according to Provea, now arrested on terrorism charges. So anything that kind of goes against that narrative is just dismissed.
And I mean, do you think that the real numbers will ever be released?
No, the CNE are now saying that they had a computer hack and that's why they can't release the official numbers. So I think it would be quite awkward for them to then go back on it and say, actually, no, we found the numbers somewhere. What we do have, as you mentioned earlier, are the actas, which were the records of votes at the time from the voting stations. The opposition have around 80% of those, which they've digitised and put online. The Maduro regime is saying that those are false.
And how long can he hold on? I mean, more and more countries are rejecting his win. Will there come a point when the leadership is just no longer sustainable?
It's an interesting question because it seems like nothing will force Maduro out unless the military change their mind. And at the moment, the military is still very much in support of Maduro. The question, though, is kind of how long can he keep ruling a country where so many people are against him? We've still, even on Wednesday, there was a huge protest again against him. The opposition leaders are currently out for arrest. So Edmundo González is in hiding, but still making statements online. Maria Corina Machado is also facing arrest, but appeared at that protest in Caracas on Wednesday. So I think for as long as people keep coming out and keep putting that pressure on, it makes it harder for Maduro to stay in power. But I don't think any of these individual statements against him are going to be the thing that pushes him out.
Katie, thank you very much. That was Katie Brown from the University of Exeter. Now, here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebello with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Georgina. Israel's military and the Palestinian militant group Hamas have agreed to 3-day pauses in fighting in Gaza to allow for the first round of vaccinations of children against polio. The vaccination campaign is due to start on Sunday, with the pauses scheduled to take place between 6 a.m. and 3 p.m. local time. Around 640,000 children will be inoculated. In the US, the Pentagon has approved a request to provide the Secret Service with additional military support capabilities for presidential and vice presidential candidates. It follows the assassination attempt of Republican nominee Donald Trump at a campaign rally last month. And the Pacific Island Forum wants to boost police numbers among its members to cut the need to rely on external forces in a crisis. The bloc of 18 nations has the potential to play a strong and active role in regional security to counter the influence from China. The members also want to hold talks with the leaders of New Caledonia, which has been riven by months of riots, to try and resolve the crisis. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Carlotta. Now let's get the latest business news with Isabel Hamilton, who's a senior reporter at the Daily Upside. Isabel, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
There's some news from Uber and a new investment. Tell us more.
Yeah, so Uber has made a strategic investment into a UK-based startup called Wave, and Wave builds software to make cars self-driving. And this investment is interesting because Uber has been really interested in self-driving technology, but a couple of years ago, they kind of had to hit the brakes. They were developing their own technology, and there was a tragic accident that actually killed someone. So they ended up selling off their in-house self-driving division. But now they seem to be sort of rebuilding up their ambitions by striking these strategic partnerships, and Wave seems to be a part of that.
Staying with petrol cars with combustible engines, Shell is to cut 20% of its workers in oil and gas exploration units. Why?
Yeah, well, Shell has been on this big cost-cutting campaign ever since they got a new CEO at the beginning of last year. And so far, a lot of the cuts have been in renewables, but this is the first really deep cut that we're seeing in their actual fossil fuel business. And yeah, they're just trying to get operating costs down, basically. And I saw some commentary in the Financial Times. We don't know whether they've got perhaps some overstaffing in that department, or they are just thinking that they're going to slim down that portfolio in the future. It's really hard to tell.
And finally, let's have a look at OpenAI and Anthropic, because there's a question here about regulators testing their models for safety.
Yeah, so OpenAI and Anthropic, which is another very significant AI startup, have agreed to let the US AI Safety Institute, that's a part of the US Department of Commerce, actually have a first look at their models when they build new ones and test them for risks and, sort of predict how they could be problematic. And this is kind of playing out against the backdrop of California lawmakers really driving forward domestic law on testing AI and making sure that it's safe. So it's quite like a big, they're sort of taking regulators under the hood, as it were.
Isabel, thank you. That's Isabel Hamilton there. And this is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, Australia and Indonesia have significantly upgraded their military relationship by signing a defence agreement, and they plan to hold the largest joint military exercise in their history in November. Well, joining me now is Joe Rachman, who's a journalist who covers Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Joe, it's really lovely to have you on the programme today. You're usually based in Jakarta. Why are you in London?
I was just here for a friend's wedding, but I'll be jetting back next week to catch up with all the news. Everything seems to have kicked off in August while I was away.
Absolutely. A lot of news coming out of the region. I mean, this document was signed yesterday between Australia and Indonesia. It's described as treaty level, but not a military alliance. But what's the distinction?
Well, the most important thing is that Indonesia has a very, very strong attachment to itself as a non-aligned, non-bloc country. The idea of an alliance is sort of anathema to its foreign policy establishment. So this may be as close as you can get in a defensive relationship with Indonesia, because an alliance is off the table. You get as close as you can, but you don't say it's a defence pact or an alliance or something like that. There is actually some history to this. In 1995, there was the Suharto-Keating Treaty, which came very, very, very close to an alliance. It said that if Indonesia or Australia would consult if their defence interests were adversely affected with each other, and this was seen as very close. This gets broken in 1999 when Australia intervenes in East Timor as Indonesia's occupation ends there. So Indonesia and Australia have done this dance before of building this very, very close. It's sort of like Adam and God's finger on the Sistine Chapel. It's almost there, but you can't quite touch. But there's an ambiguity as well here, because they still haven't released the full text of the treaty. So we don't quite know how far we should read into this. Is this like a 1995 moment where they're becoming allies in all but words? I don't think so. No, there's been no indication of that. But we don't know how close they've brung themselves. We've just got generalities, which is sort of interesting.
And I mean, we do know that there are lots of different elements of the agreement. It's not just military. They're looking at cooperation in terms of training and all sorts of things.
Yeah, so Indonesia's undergoing a military modernisation kick at the moment. That's been overseen by Defence Minister Prabowo Subianto, who's also due to be inaugurated as president on the 20th of October. So I think that they're probably interested in what Australia can offer them there. And also, there's a bit of... I think there's a bit of diplomatic nicety to this stuff that you say, we're going to do this, this and this, and then you have the other nice to haves which show that you're all simpatico and getting on well. I think that's sort of what's going on here.
I mean, China clearly is one of the reasons why this relationship is necessary for both countries.
Yes, indeed. Australia's always thought of Indonesia in terms of, it's sort of it of we need to have a good relationship with Indonesia because it's huge and to the north of us, and B, as a potential counterweight to China. The biggest advocates of closer relationships with Indonesia tend to be Australians who are a bit sceptical of the US security commitments in the long term and see Indonesia as actually a better bargain because Indonesia can't get up and go in the same way as the US can. Now, meanwhile, for Indonesia, it's got a conflict with China in the northern Tuna Sea. This is China's famous or infamous 9-dash line, as you prefer it. So there's a conflicting claims over territorial waters, which also contain oil and gas deposits. There is a question of whether this is a signal that Prabowo is going to take a slightly tougher line on China by, amping up military cooperation with figures like, with countries like Australia and the US. That's possible, but they're going to have to walk a really fine line there because they're very, very dependent on China for investment. And I think that they're aware of that. So there's maybe Prabowo. I had an interesting conversation though with a pretty well-informed Indonesian academic who chats to the military and chats to the foreign policy establishment, and he says Prabowo is aware that he needs to manage this relationship with China. His first visit abroad after winning the election was to China. But equally, he's a nationalist and he's known to have he's a great believer in military strength, and he's also known to have a bit of a short temper. So they were like, if something goes wrong, they say he has the potential to really hit the roof. So they're a little bit nervous about that.
Concern has been voiced by Human Rights Watch, who say that Australia should use this opportunity to fulfil the human rights related commitments that previous Indonesian administrations had made but failed to actually stick to. What are those commitments? What is the human rights problem there?
I think the most obviously pressing one at the moment would be Papua. So West Papua is it's various Indonesian provinces there. It used to be two provinces, but they've been split up. There have been ongoing independence movements within West Papua for a long time, and there's been human rights abuses tied to that. Indonesia is incredibly sensitive about this issue. It's got a deep streak of paranoia almost about irredentism within its own country because it's huge and thousands of islands. If bits start breaking away, it's worried it could disintegrate. But it's also got an army which is not very, very weak accountability for what it does. Business interests wrapped up in Papua, wrapped up in political interests, possibly wrapped up with retired generals. It's very murky. We don't really know. And you've also got a fair bit of racism towards Papuans in Indonesia as well. So you get all those things. That's probably the biggest ongoing human rights concern. In terms of Australia's ability to affect that, frankly, I think Australia is probably going to keep quiet about this. It wants a good relationship with Indonesia. And Prabowo Subianto is not the type of guy that's going to take kindly to them criticising this. He'll see it as foreign interference. Not to mention he himself is a former member of Indonesia's special forces. He served in Indonesia's occupation of East Timor, which is, pretty infamous in many ways. And then he's also implicated in the kidnapping of democracy activists in 97, 98. So, Australia. I'm sure that there are people in Australia that would like the government to say more to Indonesia about its human rights commitments. Whether the Australian government thinks that that's a good idea is a very different question.
Of course, the country is on the cusp of change because in October, President Joko Widodo steps away after a decade in power. What would you say his legacy is?
Well, that's an interesting one. If you'd asked someone that 2-3 years ago, they'd have probably been much more positive. He has been a president that has overseen stability, steady growth, massive infrastructure building, massive expansion of healthcare. These are all on his plus sides. The downsides, which have really come through in the past couple of years as he's been trying to manage his succession, has been damage to Indonesia's democratic institutions, frankly. He had to step down after 2 terms. There was a brief period where it looked like he wanted to try and change the constitution to extend his term or give him a 3rd term. That went away. His solution instead was to support his defence minister, Prabowo Subianto, who has a very checkered record but sort of kowtowed to him, and also to have his son, Gibran Rakabuming Raka, run as Prabowo's vice presidential nominee. For this to even happen, there had to be a Supreme Court ruling fiddling with the minimum age of candidates. Constitutional Court ruling fiddling with the minimum age of candidates. This was widely seen as, just a purely political decision to make space for the president's son to run for the vice president, not helped by the fact that the head of the Constitutional Court at the time was Jokowi's brother-in-law, who then was subsequently forced to resign over an ethics violation of having presided over this case in the first place. There's been other things. There's been sort of state power used to boost the Prabowo campaign and sort of do some sort of low-level harassment of the opposing campaigns during the presidency. There's been use of corruption investigations, which will go on and off depending on how the president feels about you and depending if he thinks you're towing the line. So yeah, there's been, this has done real damage to both Jokowi's reputation and the democratic institutions of Indonesia over the past couple of years, no matter what his achievements have been in other economic areas.
Joe, absolutely fascinating. I hope that we're going to be in regular touch with you now. And I was particularly impressed by the way the name of the president's son tripped off your tongue in such an impressive way.
I've been practicing. You learn to pronounce the very polysyllabic Indonesian names.
Jay Rachman, thank you very much indeed. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. In Prague today, the Global Security Forum, Globsec, is underway, bringing together leaders and ministers from Central and Eastern Europe, but also their Western counterparts, for a dialogue about Europe's future and its common defence. Monocle's Chris Chermak spoke with Kersti Kaljulaid, Estonia's former president and now on the board of directors of Globsec. She began by describing the conference and its importance.
Globsec is an up-and-coming conference and it is outgrowing its region, I would say, even if, of course, it is still the most important exchange for the security, defense and foreign policy, but also economy, new technologies, type of thinkers of the region, and this way it's very valuable. But of course we know that Globsec has made an outreach to Northeast European countries, trying to connect also more there. So it is ambitious, it's growing, and I think it is a good sign that there is never enough good places where to discuss these matters. Well, new European Commission is coming up. This is also very important that we connect with European Commission here and keep working with them to remind that Central and Eastern Europe is here and ready to contribute.
You did mention the European Commission. I wonder if you could speak about, from Estonia's perspective in particular, the fact that Kaja Kallas will be a member of the new Commission, the EU's High Representative. What does that mean for Estonia, and does it show to you, I guess, that the Baltic region as well and countries like Estonia have a say in Europe, in European defense, in a way that perhaps they didn't 5-10 years ago?
Well, she's going to be, I hope, because fingers crossed, parliamentary hearings are still ahead of all line commissioners, so it's still to come, I believe. And I sincerely hope that Kaja Kallas will be a really valuable member for the Commission, precisely because she knows very well, of course, the questions of East and Eastern Europe and Eastern Partnership, but also she's really, long-term member of European Parliament, knows how this factory works as well. So definitely she will be very good. It is quite rare people in Estonia said it's the first time somebody from our region gets such a job, because the last time was Donald Tusk and everybody has already forgotten that it has ever happened. So it is rare and therefore worth celebrating. But I would really like that we get to the point when that is not the issue anymore. I mean, that every time, let's say that 3-4 highest jobs are allocated, then 1-2 should be, I mean, the eastern flank, it's normal, it's natural. So I think this is just a harbinger of what to come, and there is no need precisely to discuss who is east, who is west, who is north anymore.
You've said in the past, also this year, you believe that European defence spending should hit 3% of GDP. Is there still a sense for you from that perspective as well, that particularly some of the more Western European states are just not quite understanding the seriousness yet of this moment?
Indeed, there certainly is a lack of urgency. And also, of course, if your spending has been in the range of 1%, then it's not easy to achieve a throughput for 2, yet alone 3. But I think indeed we should be planning for a long-term containment situation east of us. And then we should look how South Korea is behaving, for example, and we can see. And also, if you look back, I mean, this 3%, where it comes from, it's the Cold War period. Cold War period when there was no hot war in our neighborhood. Now there is a hot war in our neighborhood where we are supporting Ukraine. Yet I think 3% is a very big amount. And this is the most troublesome for me, that we know that Russia cannot really up its spending. It is spending 30% of budget already on military, maybe more. We may not be seeing everything. If we could double, Russia cannot double. We would have won the war already. And if you think we have an opportunity and a chance to defend free world and democracy, and we're not jumping at that opportunity. We should be jumping at that opportunity, not complaining that there are other needs in the budgets as well.
When we do speak of the war in Ukraine, there has been, of course, one particularly significant change in the last month or so with Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region, into Russia. How is that seen in the Baltic region? Is it something you encourage? Does it make you nervous, this kind of escalation?
I mean, let's make one thing clear. Ukrainians make decisions for Ukrainians. Where they go, how they run this war, I mean, where they see best opportunities, and also when it is time to end this war. All these decisions are with Ukraine. We are not advising Ukraine on that. We are supporting their fight against the aggressor, which is Russia. And that's the end of story for us.
Is it something, though, if I could ask perhaps from the perspective of the people, is it something that you worry about Russia's reaction to what is happening currently in the war in Ukraine? One could turn it also to something else that was happening, for example, in May, when Russia removed some of the border markers to Narva. There is this risk, I suppose, of escalation with anything that happens in Ukraine.
I mean, should I take more seriously these 3 boys removed from Lake Peipus close to Narva, or should I take more seriously the disturbances which were witnessed at the Finnish borders, after which Finland closed all the border crossings to Russia? Right now, by the way, Estonia is the only one who is courageous enough to have a border crossing open, and it is actually quite a problem, because I mean, everybody who wants to or needs to cross comes to our country, and making sure that people are well treated while they queue. And queues are unavoidable, because I mean, Russians also have their speed, and sometimes people are stuck between the 2 points on the bridge of Narva River and have to spend their night there. So it's a humanitarian issue as well, and we try to cope with it as well as possible. So indeed, the relations are bad. They're bad everywhere, and we are all in it together in this sense. So no difference between any countries in Europe. We don't know. I mean, what is next? The most important thing is to be ready for everything, think of unthinkable, and not to be discouraged by these actions, because we know that if you are discouraged by a bully, then the bullying continues.
Is there any imagination of what a relationship with Russia might look like in the future after this war is over? Is that something that is still at all even discussed in the Baltics?
Well, of course we do discuss, because we also realize that there is always, and has been through this 2-year and more period, and still is, that if Russian regime realizes that there is no way out with Putin, they will simply somehow find a way of somebody else who will speak 5 foreign languages, is Oxford educated, and everybody in the West will look into the eyes and say, wow, that's our guy. And then we start just new cycle. We must understand that, I mean, Russia changed means that, I mean, Russian children learn in school from Holodomor to this current aggression and everything in between, all occupations, gulags, everything. This has to be part of the curricula, like it was in Germany after the Second World War. That would be changed Russia, and then we can rebuild good relations. Till that day, I'm afraid it's containment. It's costly, but of course it is cheaper than not taking notice.
And that was Kersti Kaljulaid, Estonia's former president, speaking with Monocle's Chris Chermak at Globsec in Prague. And we do have a team there, so you will be hearing a lot of reports from Globsec over the next few days. Now,
I went to hell and back to find myself on track. I broke the code, whoa, like a night.
that is The Code, sung by Nemo, who won the 68th Eurovision Song Contest last year. They were representing Switzerland, so this year the competition will be hosted in the country, and there's been much speculation about exactly where, with Geneva, Zurich and Basel all strong contenders. Well, this morning it was announced that Basel will be the host. Well, I'm joined now by our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, and our Eurovision correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Hello to you both. Tyler, where do we find you today?
Bonjour, I'm in Paris, Georgina, and it's really an interesting announcement, interesting time, interesting that I'm also in Paris, because this was really a huge story in Switzerland. Of course, the fact that Switzerland will be hosting Eurovision in 2025, that the fact that, of course, the country made it through, so much excitement around that. But then this became really a competition in its own right between the three biggest cities, the three hubs of the country. And some weeks ago, Zurich backed out. We were very disappointed because we thought how fantastic, of course, having our substantial setup in Zurich. It would have been great. Yes, indeed, Eurovision would have been right on our doorstep. Now it's not far away with this Basel announcement. But I think here's the interesting bit. Zurich backed out because they thought it was simply going to be too much money, and there's been a lot of discussion around the funding for the state public broadcaster. So that called a few things into question. But I think it's interesting because here I am in Paris, which is going to be soon hosting Paris Art Basel. And so there's a lot of discussion. Will actually Art Basel eventually just be in Paris? So it's very interesting that Basel sort of jumped at an opportunity to host another big event when there's some question marks about whether it has a future in the art space.
I mean, what does Basel bring to the table in terms of the city itself?
Well, I think there's a few things. It is used to hosting major events, not events of this scale. But if you think back to, of course, the Basel Watch Fair was really one of it. This is another thing the city has lost as well, Georgina. So the world used to come to Basel every single year for the most important watch show on the calendar. That has now changed. That has migrated to Geneva, and Geneva is host to Watches and Wonders. So I would say that the first big loss, obviously, has been that. Now we know Eurovision is not an annual competition unless you've got it's an annual competition, but it always moves around. But I think that this is also probably going to be a moment for the city to say, we're reasonably well connected when it comes to aviation. There's quite a solid airport. You can fly in from all over Europe. Long haul, of course, is really Zurich. But here's the thing. It's almost like going across London. The distance between Zurich and Basel might be significant, but of course the rail gets you there in less than an hour. I mean, you can probably do Basel, Zurich in 50 minutes.
Let me just bring in Fernando now. Fernando, Switzerland actually won the very first Eurovision.
Yes, I mean, it is considered the birthplace of Eurovision. They hosted in Lugano back in 1956. And I was thinking about it. I'm not sure if Tyler would agree with me. So they hosted twice, in Lugano and in Lausanne in 1989. So German Switzerland never actually hosted Eurovision. So I wonder, of course, you have to see which city, has the better plan. I mean, the better ambitions for such a big event like this. But I think it's quite important that a city like Basel should host as well. Funny, I actually, for a moment, I thought it was going to be Geneva, but then I think Basel got the crowd at the last minute.
But I mean, Tyler, of course, this is a good thing for the country as a whole. What will it do in terms of soft power status?
I think this is a huge moment for Switzerland to step up. Of course, you have Basel, a city which really also plays on its that it's really a tri-nation city because you can travel on the tram and cross into France, and you can cross into Germany, and of course the city has amazing art and design credentials. You have, of course, the Basel Foundation is there, probably one of the best art museums in Europe. Vitra, of course, it's home to one of the best design companies in Europe. And then at the same time, it's a global pharma hub. When you think, why do we think of Basel? Well, oftentimes, if you're going to look on a pill pack or something, you'll notice the name Novartis or Roche. And of course, those are two of the world's biggest players in pharmaceuticals. And they're significant players, and not just in a business space, but also huge contributors to art, design, and culture through their initiatives as well. So I think that this is an opportunity for, of course, Switzerland, brand Switzerland, to talk up all of its attributes, and also show that this is a nation which hosts some of the best collections in art around the world. So I think this is really a chance for the country, I think, to perhaps change the narrative that it's a bit of a sleepy place, but also it already did that, of course, with Nemo's win this year.
I mean, talking about its successes in those other areas, is it known to be, Basel in particular, Fernando, known to be successful in music?
Well, I was doing some research. I mean, of course, with art, it's undeniable that Basel has its influence. But I was looking at music. I mean, to be honest, DJ Antoine is from there. He's one of the most successful Swiss artists of all time. I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm the biggest fan. He had massive hits, Welcome to Saint-Tropez. There's a Swiss rock band called Love Bugs as well. But I think it's a great opportunity, to show them off. And I was looking at the Basler Zeitung, the regional paper from Basel. They're very excited. It's been reported that there's been tears of joy in the newsroom. So it's a big deal, to host an event like this.
I know that you are certainly going to be there at Eurovision in Basel. And as you do every year, you'll be partying at the Euro Club. Tyler, will you be joining him?
I don't know. I have to see if my train pass gets me that far. But I do think, Georgina, we're definitely going to have a lead-in weekend. The same thing happens also with Art Basel. A lot of things also happen in Zurich. And of course, from a hotel capacity, I think a lot of people will be staying in Zurich and, of course, shuttling into Basel. So I think that the party is going to stretch to both cities.
Excellent. Monocle's editorial director, Tyler Brûlé there, and Monocle's Eurovision correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Thank you, Tyler and Faye. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing, which was produced by Carlotta Rebello. Our researcher was Sani Jamani and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back on Monday at the same time. I'm Georgina Godwin. Goodbye and thanks for listening.